I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 19. Finally, some allies. December 2021, Washington, D.C., White House. Sitting at the table in the treaty room of the White House were the leaders of Poland, Romania, the United Kingdom, Australia, and India. This gathering of world leaders had taken some time to arrange. Many of these once staunch allies of America had been taking a wait-and-see approach to observe how the internal conflict in the U.S. played out. The leaders hadn't wanted to pick a side, only to find out later they had backed the wrong horse. The EU and other world leaders who had sided with the UN, and then Senator Tate, had found out the hard way what happens when you pick the wrong side. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming and agreeing to meet with me," said President Sachs as he started the meeting. The White House steward brought in a couple pots of fresh coffee and a pot of hot water for tea, should anyone want some. Sachs made some small talk until the steward left, and then they were once again alone in the room. When he'd had a few sips of coffee himself, the president set his drink down on the table. "The last year has been a dark chapter in my nation's history," he began. "There was a point when I wasn't sure America would survive, but we have, thanks to the hard work of our intelligence and law enforcement agencies who uncovered this conspiracy. Putting all of that aside, now it's time to discuss how we are going to right some of these wrongs and deal with China." The Prime Minister of Australia quickly chimed in. "You can count on us, President Sachs. While we haven't sustained the same level of destruction your country has, the Chinese hit my country hard with that EMP. It caused considerable damage to nearly half our country. We are only just now getting power restored to parts of the country. My people have been clamoring for payback." The president smiled. "Thank you for your support." "Poland is also ready to support your nation in any manner we can," confirmed the Polish leader. "The Russians lost a substantial part of their Western European army fighting you, and it's left them in a very weakened state. With the threat on our own border significantly reduced, I feel confident that my country can commit a large portion of our military to your country to help you defeat the Chinese." Poland had already contributed 16,000 soldiers to fight along the American southwest border. They had played a pivotal role in Operation Spartan's success. The Romanian Prime Minister also offered up her nation's support. She informed the group she'd authorized the deployment of more than 25,000 troops in addition to the 14,000 they had already sent. The British Prime Minister added, "Mr. President, the United Kingdom will continue to do its part to help. I've asked for our regular army to be doubled in size, and I believe Parliament will approve that request given what has transpired at the UN. China is a global menace. What they are doing in the southwest of your country is abhorrent. They need to be defeated before they are able to grow into a larger force than we are able to collectively handle." All eyes then turned to the leader of India, the one nation that shared a border with China and had an army that could threaten them. Prime Minister Bamra hadn't said anything during the meeting thus far. Clearing his throat, Bamra finally spoke. "I agree that China is a menace, and that what they have been doing with the kidnapping of your women and the extermination of your sick and elderly is appalling. The question I am grappling with is exactly how India should respond to this threat. Unlike your nations, we have a very long, shared border with China. We have billions of dollars a year in trade between our countries, but more importantly, China has allies near us. The President of Pakistan has already made overtures to us that if we were to get involved in this war and attack China, they would honor their defense pact and declare war on us. While India could certainly handle a war against China, now that most of their nuclear forces have been destroyed, a simultaneous war with Pakistan, whose nuclear weapons are still very much in play, could prove to be disastrous for my nation. The PM paused for a moment and looked around. Sachs could see that the other world leaders were just as disappointed by Bamra's statement as he felt. After an awkward pause, the Prime Minister cleared his throat. However, I believe my nation could provide substantial material support to your war efforts against the Chinese, he offered. In the case of Australia, we can send in thousands of technical experts to help you recover faster from the EMP attacks. We can send large quantities of war stocks and other materials to your nations as you build up your forces to fight the Chinese. We can also offer substantial intelligence reporting on what the Chinese are doing and what is going on inside their country. President Sachs had feared the Indians would back out of a military confrontation with the Chinese. It had been a long shot trying to get them to join the war, and he understood the predicament they were in. They had a nuclear-armed enemy on their other border they had to think about. Mr. Prime Minister, I recognize that India is being placed in a tough position, Sachs acknowledged. My government cannot offer any direct military assistance to you as of right now. However, I could speak with the President of Pakistan, or at least his ambassador, and make it clear to them that any nuclear attack on India by their forces would result in a nuclear retaliation by the United States, he offered. And I can have a ballistic missile submarine positioned off their coast to ensure their compliance. If a war were to erupt between India and China, and potentially Pakistan, we could issue that ultimatum that the fighting has to stay conventional. I've already demonstrated to the world that I will not only use nuclear weapons, I will use them in a fashion that will destroy our enemies. President Sachs paused for a moment as he weighed what he was about to say next. If an overt threat won't work, I have another option. PM Bamra appeared more than a little uncomfortable with the discussion of nuclear weapons. He shifted back and forth in his seat. I am open to hearing your alternate plan, Mr. President, especially if it does not involve nuclear weapons. Sachs smiled and leaned in. My country has been concerned about Pakistan's nuclear weapons for some time. We've gone to great lengths to identify where they are located. We've also gone to great lengths to infiltrate their power grid, in case we needed to remove their nuclear weapons. If India were to join the war against China, we could provide you with the location of their nuclear weapons so they could be attacked. Furthermore, we could also turn the lights out in the country prior to your attack to ensure your mission's success. With their electrical grid down and their nuclear weapons largely removed, Pakistan would not pose the same threat to you as they presently do. The three other world leaders looked at Sachs and shivered. Everyone knew that the American leader had changed after being stuck in a tunnel for nearly a week, but it clearly made them uncomfortable how he cavalierly spoke about inflicting damage on a country that could lead to the deaths of millions. Sachs saw the Indian PM hesitate, so he moved in to try and convince him. Bamra, this war needs to end. We cannot allow it to drag on for years. I have no intention of invading China, but we need to get them to stop sending more people to my country. I've already conveyed to you a preferential trade agreement ensuring India would have a fixed price for oil and natural gas for the next 10 years. That deal is not for you to sit on the sidelines and play wait and see. We need India's help now to bring this war to an end. It's not that easy, Mr. President, Bamra insisted. You're asking me to gamble the lives of my own people. This puts me in a terrible position. Of course my country would like this trade deal, but you are asking me to seal it with the blood of my citizens and the people of Pakistan. I'm just not sure I can do that." Sachs sighed. He was doing his best not to lose his patience, but he was getting mad with how many once strong allies had turned their backs on him at the outset of this war. "Mr. Prime Minister, are you essentially telling me that you want to wait another 3 or 4 months to see who it looks like is going to win this war before you pick a side or choose to get involved?" he asked. The British PM sat back in his chair and lifted his cup of tea to his lips, as if he were watching an entertaining boxing match on the television. PM Bamre paused for a moment, carefully weighing his response. "My apologies, Mr. President. That is not what I meant to imply. My concern is the Pakistani nuclear weapons. If they were able to initiate an attack before their weapons were taken offline, they could devastate my nation. If India is to invade China, then I need some help from you in ensuring Pakistani missiles won't rain death on our cities. If you could perhaps send some of your ballistic missile interceptors and convey your threat to them, then I will work out with my generals the best time to open a second front with China." Sachs grinned and sat forward in his chair. "Excellent. We'll begin transferring a couple of THAAD batteries immediately. They did incredibly well for us." "The Chinese did manage to get a few through, though," commented the Polish PM, who seemed to immediately realize that he'd made a huge gaffe. Sachs shot the Polish president a dirty look. "A lot more would have gotten through without them," he countered, practically hissing. "I've made my point clear to China. If they attempt to use nuclear weapons against Americans again, I will turn their entire country to radioactive dust. They won't use nukes again. As to Pakistan, their missiles are crap. The THAAD will more than handle them. Besides, when we turn the lights off, they'll have more pressing concerns to deal with." The British PM loudly exclaimed, "Excellent! Then I think we all have a deal. Let's drink another round of tea and work out the details." Sachs smiled, glad the Brit had spoken up. His relationship with Bamre was tenuous at best. He felt betrayed by the Indians for not coming to his aid earlier, but now he had to rely on them to open a second front against China, something he knew they didn't want to do. Situation Room, 8 hours later. General Adrian Marcus felt like he had aged 10 years in the span of 6 months. Since taking over as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night or taken a single day off. While he was grateful to have been chosen to replace General Peterson, he felt incredibly overwhelmed in the position. He had enjoyed being the head of the Air Force. Before he'd taken over that position, he'd met with the CEOs of several major corporations, learning what they were doing to minimize waste and increase productivity, and how they were incorporating AI. General Marcus had wanted to use these lessons to make the military more efficient. After seeing the driverless cars, he'd promoted an initiative to create a new series of pilotless fighters that could help handle the never-ending increased demand for Air Force assets. That had all been 3 years ago. Now, all his energies were focused on trying to build up the necessary fighting force to defeat the foreign invaders on American soil and prepare the military to bring the fight to China. General Marcus looked down at his watch. He had about 20 minutes until the President, the National Security Advisor, and the President's Chief of Staff would arrive. Truth be told, he just wanted to take a nap, but that was entirely out of the question. Reaching for his coffee cup, Marcus downed the rest of its contents before signaling for one of the majors in the room to get him a refill. Then he turned to his briefer. "Do we have the latest updates from General Tibbets and Operation Spartacus?" he asked. The officer nodded. "We do. I just got their 6 slides a few minutes ago and updated them in the master deck. We're good to go." Looking at his notes again, General Marcus tried to figure out if he should start with the military updates of the battles going on or the production status of the war stocks and troop training. He remembered how one of his mentors had said, "Amateurs talk tactics, experts talk logistics." It never failed to amaze him how a single kink in the production of a weapon system could have a profound impact on the entire fielding of a tank brigade, or how a shortage of ammunition could delay the graduation of 5,000 recruits from basic training. Suddenly, the room began to fill up as everyone that needed to be at the meeting started showing up. Then the president walked in with his 2 senior advisors, and everyone stood. He promptly motioned for them to take their seats and signaled for General Marcus to get the ball rolling. General Marcus nodded to his briefer. Major Brian Schultz depressed the button on his pointer to bring up the first slide, which showed a large-scale map of southern Colorado sprinkled with a lot of different unit icons. "Mr. President, the next couple of slides will go over the results of Operation Spartacus," announced Major Schultz. The president nodded and signaled for him to continue. To start the campaign, the U.S. Air Force, along with the British Royal Air Force, carried out a series of missions, suppressing the enemy air defenses along the front lines and as deep as 70 kilometers behind their lines. These missions were quickly followed up by more than 300 multi-role fighters and ground attack aircraft from the U.S. and RAF going after specific enemy strongpoints and high-value targets. Next, 2 squadrons of B-52 bombers carried out a massive carpet-bombing mission of the enemy front lines and their fortified positions. Our B-1 bombers swooped in next and went after the rear echelon troops and the units that were being held in reserve and plastered them pretty good. Following the multi-hour-long aerial attack, the 101st Airborne Division and the British 16 Air Assault Brigade were successfully deployed behind the enemy lines here and here. Major Schultz used the laser pointer to show on the map where these units had been dropped, 60 kilometers behind enemy lines. Next, the 4th Infantry Division and the British 3rd Division conducted a frontal assault on the enemy's main lines here, here, and here, Schultz explained as he again used his laser pointer. While this was happening, an armor brigade from the Mississippi National Guard broke through the enemy's right flank here. This breakthrough was exploited by the 1st Infantry Division, which we had been holding in reserve for just this type of situation. Once they were through the gap in their lines, they were able to make a mad dash and cut some 90 kilometers behind the enemy's lines and secured the city of El Moro along Interstate 25. This put them roughly 20 kilometers from the New Mexico border, but more importantly, it completely encircled the PLA's 16th and 26th Army Groups, or Corps-level units. The president interrupted. "How many enemy soldiers are now trapped in this pocket?" General Marcus jumped in to answer this question. "Roughly speaking, Mr. President, 130,000 to 160,000 troops, so it's a sizable force. More importantly, these are combat units, not rear echelon or support troops." "Are they going to surrender?" asked Sachs. "I have to imagine the Chinese will do their best to bust them out of that pocket if you aren't able to get them to capitulate." Marcus nodded. "We're working on that as we speak. They've been trapped now for 48 hours. That's after roughly 2 days of heavy fighting to get them surrounded. They've been expending a lot of ammunition, fuel, and other consumables that aren't getting replaced. Right now, we're tightening our grip on them with additional forces moving into the area. Tomorrow, most of 5th Corps arrives in Colorado Springs. They'll give us another 70,000 fresh soldiers. We are also using the Air Force to really pound them hard. If I had to guess how long they'll hold out, I'd say probably a week at best." Seemingly happy with the response, The president signaled for Major Schultz to continue. Out west, the Marines have reached Portland. They have met some resistance from the locals, but they've largely put down any civil disturbances. DHS's Federal Protective Service officers are moving into the city and the surrounding area to take control of it from the Marines. They'll move to join up with 2nd MEF and elements of 3rd MEF. We should be able to keep the Chinese contained in California with their added force. Next, Schultz brought up a slide of the Pacific. The Chinese do appear to be moving forces in and around Hawaii. With the sinking of 2 more of our carriers, and the 3rd one having to retreat back to Washington State for repairs, we don't have a lot of forces left to protect the island. Our cruisers and destroyers, in conjunction with our land-based aircraft, are doing a good job of keeping them from getting too close, but that'll only last so long. Although we've secured Johnston Atoll, Midway and Wake Islands, so that did put a dent in their ambitions. Is Hawaii in danger of being invaded? Asked the president, clearly concerned that they might lose the American stronghold. Schultz shook his head. No, sir. At least not yet. The Chinese Navy would need to finish off our surface fleet we have protecting it. Even if they manage to do that, they have yet to clear the area of our subs. We have about half of our available subs protecting the Alaskan coast and the upper west coast around Oregon and Washington State, about a quarter running interdiction operations along the California and Mexican and South American coasts, and the remaining quarter protecting Hawaii and going after the Chinese supply lines. It's tough going, as we have an enormous area to patrol and protect, but we're keeping the Chinese at bay. The briefing went on for another hour as Major Schultz got the president and his advisors up to speed on the war and where things stood. When he was done, Sachs turned to General Marcus and asked, "How are we doing on training and equipping our new army? Are we still on track?" Nodding, Marcus replied, "We are, in most areas. A few areas still having some trouble, but we'll get there." "Okay. How about you tell me where the problems are?" asked the president. "Perhaps I can place a call and help get things moving if that's all it takes." Sometimes a call from the President of the United States to a CEO of a company would be enough to light a fire under someone's butt. The strategy did work, but it was seldom used. "Right now, it's ammunition production," General Marcus responded. "With the war going on, and civil disturbances still taking place in many parts of the country, the civilian ammunition consumption rate is huge. People are basically buying out whatever is available. The manufacturers can make 4 times as much money selling to the civilian marketplace than they can to the government. So, while they aren't not fulfilling our orders, they are taking a lot longer than they should. This is having a knock-on effect. We're not getting all the new recruits qualified with their rifles, so we're either delaying their graduations or cutting down the number of training rounds." Sachs was visibly frustrated. He turned to one of his aides. "Get me the names of the CEOs who owned those companies, and I'll call them after this meeting is over," he directed. Then he turned back to General Marcus. "What's the next problem?" the president asked. "We're burning through tanks and other armored vehicles. Same with aircraft. We're just taking a lot of combat losses. Nothing like the Chinese are, but our stuff is a bit more complex to make than theirs. The factory in Lima, Ohio is cranking out main battle tanks as fast as they can, but we're having issues with General Motors and Ford. As you know, a lot of their manufacturing plants are in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Well, those areas got pretty trashed during the UN invasion, and then by the militia units. They're taking a bit longer to get repaired than some of our engineers believed they should have." Sachs held a hand up to stop him. "Are you saying they're intentionally delaying the production of critical armored vehicles?" he asked, visibly upset. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're prioritizing work at their other facilities to keep producing civilian vehicles and trucks over getting those other factories up and running and retooled to produce armored vehicles and other equipment we need. So if GM and Ford switched their factories in the South to producing war stocks, while they rebuilt their factories in the North to produce civilian vehicles, would that solve the problem? Asked the President. Marcus nodded. It would. General Pruitt, the head of the Army, sighed. He had largely stayed silent during the meeting, but he clearly felt the issue was important enough for him to chime in. Mr. President, during World War II, the American auto manufacturers took several years off from producing new vehicles and focused solely on producing the tools needed to win the war. Maybe the reason our current manufacturers haven't come to that same conclusion yet is that they don't realize how desperate the war really is. For nearly 80 years, our country hasn't been directly threatened to a point where our entire economy became solely focused on producing weapons and ammunition. We need to make it clear to these companies that we are presently in that same level of crisis, and they need to get on board with helping us defeat the Chinese. The generals and advisors discussed what General Pruitt had said for half an hour as they sought to figure out how to incentivize and, if necessary, strong-arm the thousands of manufacturers across the country to produce the tools of war needed to defeat the Chinese. At the end of the military briefing, everyone left the room except the President and his National Security Advisor. Then the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Attorney General, and the Director of the FBI walked in with a few of their aides in tow. When everyone had gone through their initial greetings and taken a seat, Sachs asked, "Secretary Hogan, how is the task of bringing law and order back to the rest of the country coming along?" Patty Hogan leaned forward in her chair before she responded. "Steady, Mr. President. We are graduating some 25,800 federal police officers from training each month. I've been ordering most of these graduates to the East Coast and the Pacific Northwest as requested. We still have roughly 70,000 federal officers operating in the South and East part of the country, putting out fires in some of the hot spots the FBI has been identifying for us. As more of those areas return to normal, we'll transfer them to the hot zones in the Pacific Northwest and the Upper East Coast. I must say, Mr. President, partnering our federal police officers with the local sheriffs across the country has been a big help. It's taken time, but we are steadily putting down this internal civil war and keeping it from spreading." When DHS had first started graduating large numbers of federal police officers, they had run into the problem of where and how to deploy them. Then the head of the U.S. Sheriff Association had come up with the idea of partnering the federal police officers with the sheriff departments across the country. Each county sheriff would identify roughly how many additional federal police officers they needed to restore order to their city centers and the rural areas where a lot of the militia units had been forming and/or training. It had become a perfect pairing of local and federal law enforcement. Sachs smiled at the positive prognosis and heaped some praises on her for a job well done. Then he turned to his AG. "How did things go with the Brown trial? Has it had the intended results we wanted?" "It has," Malcolm replied. "I was actually impressed with the number of people who tuned in and watched the proceedings. We conducted a series of polls during and after the trial. As the evidence was laid out and the drone footage was shown, public opinion really flipped. Now the vast majority of people, even in the hot zones, no longer support the Civil War. Support for your administration has also risen dramatically. I think people are looking forward to the day that we return to the old order of settling our disagreements at the ballot box." The President motioned for one of his Secret Service agents to come over to him. The agent leaned down to listen to Sachs. "Tell the kitchen crew I'm going to have 10 for dinner. Let the First Lady know she may join us if she'd like, but I'm going to have to take a rain check on our private dinner." "Yes, Mr. President," the agent responded. Then he walked off to let the staff of the White House know of the change. The president returned his attention to his cabinet members. "Not a lot has been going right for our country in this war. However, you three and your staff have done an outstanding job. I'm supposed to have a private dinner with the First Lady. However, I want to treat you all to a dinner here at the White House with us. Let's take a few minutes and head upstairs. We can talk more over some food." Everyone at the table smiled, and the conversation turned into friendly banter. From time to time, Sachs liked to change up his schedule. He couldn't always do something nice for the department heads and cabinet secretaries, but one thing he certainly could do was invite them to stay for a fancy breakfast, lunch, or dinner, to break bread, talk, and spend some time getting to know the people who were responsible for so much of the managing of the country. It was a way for him to develop deep, meaningful relationships with key people. It also allowed him to get a better sense of what was going on outside the White House. Chapter 20. Battle in the Redwoods. Kernville, California, Sequoia National Forest. Despite the higher elevation in the national forest, the temperatures had moved from the low 70s to the upper 80s. For an everyday hiker, that wouldn't have been all that bad. But for a Marine lugging 110 pounds of combat gear up and down valleys and ridges, it made for some sweat-soaked patrols. After the defeat at Bakersville, Regimental Combat Team 1 had been ordered to take up a series of positions throughout the Sequoia National Forest and keep the PLA from breaking out of California and into the Nevada desert on the other side. Steadily, the Marines had been reinforced and brought back up to strength, but they were still lacking in armored vehicles, helicopters, and artillery. Not that they could move a lot of armor through the winding roads of the park. Still, it was comforting to know they could call in a Super Cobra or an Abrams battle tank to blow something up when needed. Staff Sergeant Mack, now Gunnery Sergeant Mack, was preparing to inspect the replacement Marines that had been assigned to his platoon. They had been flown in the day before, and they'd be joining him and the others out on a 2-night, 3-day patrol along the line of control. The LOC was essentially the no-man's land between the PLA and the Marines. It ran from 29 Palms down in Barstow, linked up with the Sequoia National Forest through Yosemite and Tahoe, and eventually wrapped itself around Shasta Trinity National Forest all the way to Eureka along the coast. 90,000 U.S. Marines and 130,000 Army National Guardsmen from around the country had managed to bottle up and contain 2 PLA Army groups operating in state. Twice, the PLA had tried to break through the Mojave Desert and the areas around Fort Irwin and Edwards Air Force Base. In both cases, the PLA armor had been thoroughly trounced. The desert area had been the perfect terrain for 2 of America's top weapon platforms, the M1 Abrams battle tank and the newest version of the MQ-9B Reaper drone. The new Reapers had become tank-busting machines. The improved versions were now able to carry 8 Hellfire missiles. Between the venerable Abrams and the Reapers, the PLA never stood a chance. The terrain was too wide open, and while they scored aerial victories, they had never been able to wrestle air superiority away from the Americans. Now, the battle lines had been drawn again, and it was becoming a war of logistics. Whichever side was able to equip and field its army faster would defeat the other. Gunny Mac stuck his head outside of his tent flap, looking for his new recruits. When he saw a gaggle of Marines over by the LOC, he grabbed his patrol cap and his rifle and made his way over to them. While he walked, he looked around the camp. "I really do like it here," he admitted to himself. Their company had set their base camp on a nice plateau just below the top of a ridgeline. They had a number of fighting positions built on the opposite side of the ridge and around their little makeshift combat outpost. 2 platoons would rotate guard duty on the COP, while another platoon was out on roving patrols. The 4th platoon was on QRF duty, ready to come to the aid of the platoon on patrol or one of the other nearby COPs. This allowed each of the platoons a bit of downtime and still kept them fresh should the enemy decide to do more than probe their positions. As Mac approached the replacements, they stopped their joking around and stood a bit taller, ready for his inspection. When they had arrived the night before, he'd made it clear to the NCOs that he'd inspect their gear and weapons after morning chow before they went out on patrol. He wanted them to be ready for whatever was coming, and that meant making sure their gear was ready when they needed it. As he walked up to the front of the group, he cleared his throat. In his loudest Marine voice, he bellowed, "I'm Gunnery Sergeant Mac. I'm your platoon sergeant until the enemy kills me or I get promoted. Last night, Staff Sergeant Ryder went over what was going to happen today with you. He also gave you some specific instructions on how to pack your gear and fit your kits out. Before I hand you over to your squad leaders, I want to take a moment to see if you cherries can listen and do as you're told." Mac walked up to the first guy in line and began his inspection. He got about halfway through when he cocked his head to one side as he looked at the setup of one of the Marines. The kid must have had his parents sign a waiver for him to get in, because he didn't look a day older than 16. His kit was all jacked up. The other cherries should have helped him out before this inspection, Mac thought. He looked at the young Marine's name tape. "Private Morgan, come stand next to Staff Sergeant Ryder," he ordered. The young Marine blushed at being called forward, but didn't hesitate. He stood at attention next to Staff Sergeant Ryder, facing the rest of the new recruits. "What is wrong with this Marine's kit?" Gunny Mac asked. A couple of them laughed quietly. One of the Marines poked his friend and said something Mac couldn't hear. Mac moved with lightning speed, getting in the guy's face, his nose inches away as he yelled, "You think this is funny? Some sort of joke at Private Morgan's expense?" The laughing stopped immediately. Mac began to pace in front of them, then walked up to one of the other guys who'd laughed at Morgan's setup. "Private Blount, is it?" "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant," he replied without hesitation. "Look at Private Morgan. What's wrong with his kit?" Mac asked. The private looked at Morgan for a brief second before returning his gaze to Mac. "His tourniquet pouch is on upside down. His magazine pouch is in the wrong location, and he only has 2 grenades on his chest rig." Mac nodded in satisfaction. "Outstanding, Private Blount. Now explain to me how you knew all that, and Private Morgan here didn't." The Marine looked at him nervously, and then tried to look to one of his friends for support, before Mac snapped his fingers in front of him to get his attention. "Don't look to your friends for help. I asked you a damn question, Marine. Why do you know his kit is wrong and yours is right, and Morgan apparently didn't know the difference?" Private Morgan arrived in the 2nd helicopter from Brigade, so he wasn't around when Staff Sergeant Ryder showed everyone how our kits and rucks needed to be packed for the patrol." "Outstanding, Private Blount," Mac replied, before dropping several F-bombs for effect. "Now perhaps you can explain to me why Private Morgan wasn't informed of this information when he arrived in your tent last night." A look of fear spread across Private Blount's face. I didn't show him," he admitted. His face was now beet red. "Really? You don't say?" Gunny Mac said sarcastically. "So why didn't you show him?" he asked. Mac was enjoying this little grilling. He was hoping this would turn into a good teaching moment for his new replacements. "We thought it'd be a funny joke," Blount stammered. Reaching his right hand over to grab the back handle of Private Blount's body armor, Mac proceeded to drag him to the front of the cherries and then threw him to the ground in front of Private Morgan. Then he turned to face the 14 new recruits. "Listen up, Marines," he said before swearing in several of the recruits' faces. "This isn't a joke out here. You get me?" he yelled. "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant," everyone replied. "Get this through your thick skulls. You are replacements," Mac hissed. "You are here because other Marines before you are either dead, wounded, or Chinese prisoners. You are here because we needed to replace the losses we've taken. The only original people in my platoon from the beginning of the war are me and 9 other guys. That's 10 guys from an entire platoon. When information is handed down to you, it is your job to make sure everyone else in your fire team, squad, and platoon knows it. If you see a Marine whose kit isn't the way it's supposed to be, then take the damn time to help him get it right. Don't try and play a joke on him to get him in trouble with me, because I won't take that crap. What if our cop had been hit this morning, and we all had to rush to our fighting positions? Morgan here wouldn't have been ready. He could have gotten killed, or he could have gotten several of the rest of us killed." He stared at them icily, without saying a word. He felt that he had appropriately gotten their attention at that point. "Now you all have 10 minutes to get Private Morgan's gear ready to go out on patrol. When I get back here with the lieutenant and the rest of the platoon, I had better see Morgan's gear looking like everyone else's." With his introduction and inspection of their new replacements completed, Mac turned around and headed over to the mess tent. As he walked toward breakfast, his eyes were drawn to a few of the Marines working on a couple of the new big dogs they'd been given. He made a quick stop to check on Corporal Pyro, who had been assigned one of the machines. Just before the war began, the Marines had purchased a few hundred of these quad-pedal advanced rough-terrain robots from a company called Boston Dynamics. They were the next gen in robotics, meant to help the infantry carry heavy loads in rough terrain like Afghanistan. They were essentially a 21st century version of a pack mule for patrols, something DARPA had been working on for more than a decade. The robots could carry up to 330 pounds of ammo, water, food, or whatever else the infantry squads needed, and lug it through some really rugged terrain. But all Mac really cared about with the big dog was that they finally fixed the loud buzzing noise the first generation made. Because the original big dogs were gas-operated robots, they had an exhaust system, which was rather loud. Through additional iterations, DARPA had eventually found a way to make the thing pretty quiet. Sadly, Boston Dynamics had only been able to deliver a few hundred of these machines before the war started. The company quickly fell behind enemy lines, so DARPA and the engineers from the company had to find another facility to get them built. Eventually, a facility had been settled on in central Florida, near the 2 leading robotics universities in Florida, USF in Tampa and UCF in Orlando. Now they were busy cranking these devices out for the Army and the Marines. Mac's company had been issued 4 of them, 1 per platoon. This would mark only the 3rd time they'd taken the machines out with them on patrol. Mac checked on Pyro and made sure he'd packed additional ammo and SMAW rockets. Then he made his way over to the tent to grab some morning chow. Nothing like some hot food delivered from battalion in a good old-fashioned Mermite container, he thought. When Gunny Mac entered the tent, he saw most of his guys were finishing up their breakfast. Many of them had heard his little rant, and a few applauded him when he entered. Some even let out a few cheers and jeers. Mac felt proud that the men liked him. Of course, he'd come up through the ranks and knew what he was doing. He always did his best to make sure every Marine made it home, no matter how badly they'd been wounded. Twice, Mac could have gone to the rear when he'd been hit by shrapnel, but he'd chosen to have the platoon medic remove the metal from his arm and his leg and drive on. He'd already been awarded a bronze and a silver star for his actions, which was saying something. Mac made his way to the Mermite container and grabbed 4 strips of bacon to go along with 2 biscuits and some sausage gravy. Next, he walked to the table with a thermos of coffee and filled a styrofoam cup with the black gold. He found a couple of empty seats near the rear of the tent and took a seat. Captain Ambrose, who had just been promoted to take over their company a month ago, plopped down in the chair next to him with his own plate of biscuits and gravy. "You getting our new replacements all settled in?" Ambrose asked with a smile. Mac doubted anyone on the COP hadn't heard his little beratement of the replacements. "Just breaking them in," Mac replied with a smirk as he dug into his food. "We getting a new first sergeant one of these days?" he asked between bites. "I asked the battalion CG if he could promote Master Sergeant Freeman. We need a first sergeant, and I'm tired of waiting on a replacement. Freeman's the senior guy in the company right now, so it makes sense to promote him. Freeman's been trying to get the sergeant major to keep him a master, but I think even he knows we need a first sergeant, and he'd make a good top." Mac laughed. "Freeman's just lazy. He's good at his job, but he doesn't want to take over as top. No one does. It takes him away from the fighting and instantly makes him the admin boy for you." Ambrose chuckled before he worked on finishing off his food. Mac did the same. After a moment, Ambrose changed his tone. "Mac, I wanted to talk with you about your patrol you're about to head out on. I just got back from battalion 20 minutes ago, and word has it, the PLA is going to start probing our positions sometime today. The S2 says the PLA is sending penal battalions forward to get us to show ourselves. Then they'll send their regular army units in once we've spent ourselves slaughtering the penal battalions." Mac shook his head in disgust. "That's pretty wicked stuff, sir. Is there any truth to it? Or could it just be a rumor?" Ambrose shrugged. "The S2 said the PLA just started implementing this strategy about a week ago. They tried it yesterday further up the line. In any case, I'm not taking any chances. I'm going to send out 3rd Platoon with you. If you guys run into any trouble, or you spot this kind of thing happening, then call it in. You can always fall back, but make sure you communicate what you guys are doing, okay?" "Okay. Thanks for the heads up, sir," Mac replied. "Do we have any mortar or artillery support yet?" Ambrose shook his head. "No. The artillery that was slated for RCT-1 got sent down to 29 Palms. Apparently they need it more than we do." He shrugged his shoulders. "How much good would artillery do in this environment anyways, Mac?" he asked. "I mean, these trees are huge, and any round we fired into them would most likely just explode in the canopies. There's a higher chance of fragging our own guys than actually hitting the enemy. I think swapping out mortars with extra AT-4s and SMAWs is probably going to be more effective fire support, don't you?" Mac finished off the last of his bacon before he nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you're probably right on that count, sir. Still, I just worry that if we run into a large force, we'll run out of rounds or not be able to call for fire support when we need it most." "If things get really bad, we do have Cobras we can call on," Ambrose countered. "Again, it's a little hard with the dense tree cover, but it's an option." Mac scratched his chin. "Not that I mind getting the chance to catch up, but now that you're the company CEO and not our platoon leader, why are you telling me all this and not the LT?" "Yeah, about that, Gunny," Ambrose said in a tone that foretold a hammer about to drop. "LT Mitchum got reassigned to battalion this morning during commander's call. So you're in charge of the platoon for the moment. Lieutenant Greggs from 3rd Platoon will be the only officer on patrol with you, but you've got seniority over his platoon sergeant." Man, you'd think they'd let us keep a lieutenant for more than a week before they poach him on us. Mac downed the last of his coffee. Yeah, tell me about it. I can't seem to keep these lieutenants alive long enough to get them some practical experience where they won't get themselves or their Marines killed, and battalion steals them from me if they do survive. Well, if you want, sir, you can come out with us. It'd be just like old times, Mac said, half-jokingly. Captain Ray Ambrose was one of those really likable officers. He actually listened to his NCOs and didn't just brush them off because he was an officer. Everyone in the company was glad he had taken over as CO when their last commander had been promoted up. They'd lost a lot of officers and NCOs since the start of the war, and it was good to keep the ones they liked around if possible. Ambrose looked at him with a wry grin on his face. You know what, Gunny? I think I will, he announced. I'm going to have Greg stay here, and I'll go out with you guys. Then he got up to make it happen, leaving Gunny Mac sitting there in shock. 2 hours later, the platoon had hoofed it down the side of the ridge their cop was built on and began to make their way through the underbrush and foliage of the national park. Other than the thousands of nearby Chinese soldiers hell-bent on killing them, the patrols were often a time to escape the war. The hours-long patrols through the redwood trees and underbrush of the double canopy forest were peaceful. The hikes were beautiful, so long as they could keep it in perspective and realize an ambush could happen at the drop of a hat. So far, they'd managed to travel about 2 kilometers, which placed them right up to the edge of the lock, the unofficial demarcation line between the two sides. Once they reached the line, which was waypoint Alpha, they'd report in and then continue down the lock to the next waypoint. Along the way, they'd spread the platoon out into squads as they began their slow and methodical patrol through their portion of the forest. The higher-ups at brigade had divided the national forest up into boxes. Each battalion had been assigned a set of them to patrol. This helped the powers that be know where an enemy probe was happening and what forces could be shifted around to deal with it should the probe turn into an actual attack. With hundreds of miles to protect, this was the most efficient way to break it down into manageable chunks. As they continued their steady pace through the woods, Gunny Mac looked back from time to time. Each time he did, he almost did a double take when he'd spot one of the big dogs. This was only his 3rd time on patrol with one of them, and it just seemed so odd having a mechanical robot along on a patrol with them like this. It was almost like something out of a sci-fi book. Mac had to admit, though, that little robot was a beast. It was carrying more than 300 pounds of ammo, water, and extra small rockets for the platoon. While Mac's company patrolled their portion of the lock, the other companies in the battalion took to their own. It was seldom that they'd spot a platoon from another company. When they did, the two groups would usually talk for a few minutes with each other before going their separate ways. Just in front of the demarcation line the Marines patrolled was a platoon of 2-man scout sniper teams. The 2-man teams were scattered all across the front lines and would typically act as the battalion and brigade trip flare should a large PLA force make its way towards them. By mid-afternoon, the platoon had passed waypoints Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, effectively reaching the halfway point of their daily patrol. When they made it to waypoint Foxtrot, they had been directed to stop for the night and set up a night ambush along one of the Park Service roads. The next day, they'd repeat the process and travel back to waypoint Alpha, where they'd set up another night ambush on another Park Service road before handing off their patrol to the next platoon. This meant there was a platoon always on patrol along the lock, should the enemy decide to probe their defense. As they walked toward the next waypoint, where they'd stop for lunch, Mac had to admit, Aside from the fact that Chinese soldiers were roaming these woods looking to kill him, he really loved these patrols. It was a chance to walk amongst some of the oldest and tallest trees in the world. Being able to listen to the various birds and wildlife during the day, and the owls and nocturnal animals at night, was a treasured memory of this bloody war he'd hold on for the rest of his life. When the war had started, his sergeant major had told him, "You need to find the happy moments in this terrible chaos and death, and hold on to those moments. They'll get you through the dark times. But more importantly, when this war is over, it'll give you something good to look back on besides all the death and destruction." It had been sound advice, and he'd passed it on to everyone in his platoon as well. The platoon reached the next waypoint and settled down to eat lunch. One squad stayed on watch, while the others broke out their MREs and ate. Then they switched positions and let the other squad have a few minutes to chill and eat before they moved out again. Just as they were finishing their MREs and getting ready to head back out on patrol, Gunny Mac heard a single rifle crack. The new replacement Marines immediately grabbed their rifles and sought cover. The veterans in the platoon only paused eating long enough to make sure the round hadn't been aimed in their direction before finishing their lunch. Captain Ambrose, who had been sitting near Gunny Mac, signaled for his RTO to hand him the radio handset. "Loki Base, this is Loki Actual. We just heard what sounded like a shot coming from one of the scout sniper teams near Waypoint Charlie. Break. Is there any activity in the area we should know about? Over." While they waited for a response, they heard another rifle crack. A second later, they heard the chattering of at least 2 or 3 Type 56 rifles, which were the Chinese versions of the old, venerable AK-47. The AK had a very distinctive sound when it fired, so Mac immediately knew what type of rifle it was. He also reasoned that if the enemy was using the older weapons, the gunfire probably came from a militia unit, or perhaps one of those penal battalions their intel shop had warned them about. The radio beeped, letting them know the sync cars had synced. "Loki Actual, Loki Base. Scout Team 8 is reporting a large contingent of PLA forces heading toward Waypoint Delta. Recommend you move your platoons to intercept and assess the size of the enemy unit. How copy?" Mac nodded his head in approval. It was a good call. They should have plenty of time to get over there, and 3rd Platoon was just a few hundred meters behind them for backup. 86 Marines should be more than enough to handle whatever skirmishers the PLA was probing them with. Mac stood up. "Everybody up," he shouted to his Marines. "We have an enemy probe moving to Waypoint Delta. I want all squads in a line formation. We're going to move quick to set up an ambush point before they get there. Now let's move!" Gunny Mac turned to Captain Ambrose. "Sir, I'm going to move with 1st Squad if you need me," he said. "Go ahead, Gunny. I'll stick with 3rd Squad. Holler if you run into anything." He grinned as he got up. "Follow me, Marines. Let's move," Gunny Mac ordered. He fell in next to their point man. They didn't even bother burying their MREs. They just left everything where it was. Time was of the essence if they were going to set up an ambush. They had to cover at least 800 meters to get in front of that probing force. 10 minutes into their movement, they heard several additional cracks from the scout sniper team, which were followed by a series of AK-47 rounds being fired right back at them. This only spurred them on to move faster. Chances were the enemy soldiers had no idea where the snipers were. They were just firing at whatever they thought was a sniper, or maybe they were firing just to feel like they were doing something. His point man turned to whisper to him. "Gunny, if we move much faster, they're going to hear us coming." "Maybe, but we need to get there before those guys get past our sniper team," Mac insisted. "Our guys are only a few hundred meters across the lock. That means the enemy force isn't that far away from crossing it. I want to get in position so we can use our claymores." At this rate, they were trotting through the woods at a brisk jog, barreling through a lot of the underbrush. When they reached a decent position near Waypoint Delta, Mac had the platoon fan out and take a knee. He let them catch their breath while he grabbed his 4 squad leaders to figure out where they'd build up their ambush. Captain Ambrose had come with them, but he was largely letting Mac figure out how he wanted to organize the platoon's defense. He'd then relay that information back to 3rd Platoon and have them stand by to come to their aid should they need it. Mac pointed to a spot on their left flank. "I want 1st Squad there," he directed. "Get your claymores out and be ready. Make sure you place guys on either side of that massive redwood. The enemy will try to use those trees to their advantage to get around your flanks. That whole arc is your lane." Gunny Mac turned to his next squad leader. "I want 2nd Squad on the right flank. Same as before. Get your claymores out and cover this arc. Make sure you place at least 2 guys on the far side by that fallen log. I don't want the enemy trying to circle around your right side and flank you without someone spotting them first. 3rd Squad is going to have the center. Have you guys place their claymores there, and there," Mac ordered, pointing. "Chances are you'll be facing the brunt of whatever's coming our way, so be ready." That left 4th Squad, his heavy weapons squad. Get your rocket teams interspersed with the other 3 squads, and make sure you have your M240Gs spaced out so they can provide solid interlocking fields of fire, Mac ordered. Get their replacement barrels ready and start unpacking the extra ammo and SMAWs for the rocket teams, okay? His heavy weapons squad leader nodded. Captain Ambrose came up to him with his RTO. "Do you think we should bring up 3rd Platoon to reinforce our positions?" he asked. "Not yet," Mac replied. "I need to see how large this enemy force is first, sir. It could just be a platoon like us, but let's find out." "I'm going to have Corporal Pyro launch his scout drones then," Ambrose countered. "He's been begging to use them, and we could use some eyes on what we're facing." He then got up and left with his RTO to go find Pyro. When they'd been given several surveillance scout drones, Mac had picked Corporal Pyro to be the guy who'd get trained up on how to use them. He'd already been trained on how to operate the big dogs, so it was easy for him to pick up the drone operations as well. The next few minutes went by in a blur of activity as everyone got ready for whatever was coming toward them. Mac asked one of the Marines where Corporal Pyro had ended up, and he was directed to an area behind one of the big redwoods. As Gunny Mac approached Pyro and Ambrose, he admired the massive trees around him again. He felt sad that in less than an hour, bullets, high explosives, and shrapnel could transform this entire place into something less than beautiful. As he thought about it, his anger welled up inside him at having to fight a war inside his country like this. It incensed him that so much of California's beauty was being ripped apart by this awful war. Mac rounded the tree and fallen log where Pyro and his captain were, and he found Pyro wearing his VR headset and holding the drone controller in his right hand. The captain had what looked like an Amazon Kindle Fire device sitting in his lap, and he was looking at footage of whatever Pyro was seeing. Ambrose looked up and motioned for Mac to take a seat next to him. Gunny Mac plopped himself down, and Captain Ambrose handed him the display. Pyro had piloted the drone high enough to fly above the towering redwoods. These trees could reach heights of 300 feet and had stumps as wide as 20 feet in diameter, which was the #1 reason why mortar and artillery support was essentially worthless. An arcing round would most likely hit the upper branches or trunks before it'd land where it was needed. Pyro moved the drone a bit further away from their current location before he guided it back down through the canopy. Mac saw something that made his skin crawl. Beneath the cover of the dense forest, the enemy had moved hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers towards the various Marine positions. Ambrose whispered, "This isn't a probing attack. This is an all-out assault. I'm thinking we should order everyone back to the COP. We can probably defend ourselves from that position better than we can here. Thoughts?" Mac looked at the enemy soldiers heading toward them and thought about their own position. He shook his head. "I think we should move 3rd Platoon up here ASAP. Have 4th and 1st Platoon get things ready at the COP, and have Battalion send the QRF to the base camp. We can hold the enemy here for a little while to give Battalion time to get the QRF relocated and get us some gunship support. We don't need to make this our Alamo, but I think we should try and buy Battalion some more time by at least bloodying the enemy up." "That's a big risk, Gunny," responded Ambrose. "What if we aren't able to disengage?" Mac pointed to the screen. "Look at that, sir. On the edges and the rear of those large formations, everyone in the big cluster of soldiers appears to be holding an AK and not much else. None of them are wearing body armor or carrying rucks. At the edges of the formation and to the rear, some of the other soldiers are kitted out with body armor and modern weapons. This has to be one of those penal battalions the two-shop told you about." Ambrose shook his head in disbelief. I didn't think that was real. Wow. What kind of fight do you think they'll put up?" he asked. "Those aren't going to be motivated soldiers," Mac insisted. "I remember reading about the Soviets using penal battalions in World War II. They didn't have enough weapons for everyone, so they gave a rifle and 1 magazine's worth of ammo to every other man. Then they gave 1 magazine to the other soldiers without a rifle and told them to pick up the rifles of the dead men around them and keep charging. It was pretty brutal, but that's how they'd overrun the German positions. I don't see any of those soldiers carrying extra ammo pouches. My money says they gave everyone a rifle, but only gave them 1, maybe 2 or 3 magazines worth of ammo." "No way. They wouldn't do that. They'd run out of ammo," Ambrose quickly countered. Mac held a hand up. "Think about it. These are prisoners. They aren't going to give them a full load of ammo, grenades, and body armor. They could just as easily use that on the guards that were holding them there. No, I'd wager they gave them 1, maybe 2 magazines, telling them they could get more from the dead bodies of their comrades." While the two of them were talking, the enemy continued to get closer. Pyro broke in. "Hey, while you guys are arguing about how much ammo these guys have, they've gotten within 300 meters of our position. What do you want me to do with the drone? And are we staying and fighting or running?" "We're staying," Ambrose confirmed. "As to what you should do with the drone, go further behind their lines and see what else you can find. Maybe there are more units moving in behind them. If there are, we need to know about it." Ambrose then grabbed the radio handset from his RTO and put things in motion. His first call was to the COP to have them get ready for the incoming battle. Next, he called Battalion and then Brigade, letting them know what was happening. In a few more minutes, the battle would start, and it'd be chaos. 3rd Platoon began filtering into their lines just as the enemy approached. The birds all took flight. There was a sudden shift by the animals in the forest. Where there had been a constant din of squirrels and other woodland creatures, there was now only silence. Then Mac heard the large group of soldiers moving through the underbrush nearby. A few of them spoke in Chinese, but they remained quiet. Corporal Pyro signaled to Captain Ambrose, who immediately grabbed the tablet to see what he was getting excited about. When Mac saw the image being shown on it, his heart tightened. Behind the initial wave of attackers were at least 2 more waves of penal battalion troops. Further behind them were regular army soldiers, outfitted with body armor and modern rifles. "Pyro, make sure this feed is getting sent back to the COP, and link it to Battalion if you can," Ambrose whispered. "We need to make sure they're seeing this. Once that's done, set the drones on autopilot and pack your stuff up. We need you with your rifle. Plus, when we do start to fall back, I want you ready to move." Then he got up and headed over to the center of their position to help coordinate the 2 platoons' efforts. Gunny Mac watched as the enemy soldiers came into view. They were now no more than 120 meters from their position. Mac had the men wait until the bulk of the enemy soldiers had emerged from some of the thicker underbrush and presented a solid target for their guns. Then he yelled, "Fire!" The entire area around them erupted in gunfire. The M240 gunners raked the enemy positions with controlled 2- and 5-second bursts from their weapons, while the riflemen took well-aimed shots at them. The first 3 or 4 rows of enemy soldiers collapsed as bullets punched right through their bodies and continued on to the man behind them. Without any body armor, the enemy soldiers were torn apart by the Marines' projectiles. Loud whistles shrieked as the guards for the penal battalions ordered the prisoners forward. The return fire from the enemy soldiers steadily picked up until the Marines were being assaulted by several hundred terrified Chinese inmates. Mac heard someone grab a bullhorn and shout something angrily at the men in Chinese. Suddenly, whatever underbrush hadn't been cut down from all the gunfire parted like the Red Sea. Wave after wave of frantic Chinese soldiers screamed at the top of their lungs, charging right at the Marine positions. The first few swells of enemy soldiers fell to the ground before they even had a chance to get close to the Marines, cut down by the fuselage of gunfire. Another group of incoming prisoners managed to get within 30 meters of the Marine positions before the Marines started triggering their claymore mines. Rows of humanity that had just moments before been about to overrun them disappeared in a pink mist of blood and gore as their bodies were ripped apart by the thousands of steel ball bearings that were thrown at them from point-blank range. When those 3 waves of enemy soldiers disappeared, Captain Ambrose yelled out, "Everyone, fall back to the cop!" The Marines didn't waste a second, falling back in good order as they broke contact with the enemy, just like they had trained and done many times before during this war. One by one, each squad laid down a volley of suppressive fire while the other squads fell back about 30 meters. The Marines hurried out of there, hoping to get out of Dodge before their stunned enemy had time to figure out what had hit them. Mac and his men had run maybe 200 meters when he heard the PLA officers' whistles shriek again. Someone yelled at the men with the bullhorn again. Gunny Mac ran toward his heavy weapons squad, which was getting ready for their turn to lay down suppressive fire. "Start lobbing some smaws at the Chinese," he ordered. He hoped that might get the prisoners to hesitate. He stayed with the heavy weapons crew for a few minutes while 4 of his Marines got their launchers ready. They fired off 3 rockets each and then turned around to beat feet back to their outpost, which was still about 2,000 meters to their rear. As Mac sprinted through the woods, he spotted 2 of the big dog robots moving at a quick pace ahead of the Marines. He shook his head in disbelief. It was almost like he was on the set of a Terminator movie or something, fighting a battle with these robotic warriors. Several Marines helped their wounded comrades, carrying them to the COP, where they could be medevaced to a higher-level trauma center. As they approached the base camp, Mac's men started calling out to the guards to make sure they didn't get lit up by their own guys. Nearly all of the fighting positions were being manned by the remaining 2 platoons, but as Mac's Marines emerged from the underbrush, they ran up the designated trails and filtered into the empty positions. Then they did their best to prepare themselves for what they knew was coming their way. The 2 robotic ammo dogs that hadn't come out on patrol with them also made the rounds, allowing all the Marines who'd just arrived to grab more ammo and water. Gunnery Sergeant Mac made his way over to one of the fortified bunkers they'd built on the side of the COP's defenses. When he walked in, he saw 5 Marines manning their weapons, ready for whatever was coming next. He walked up to the Marine manning the M250 caliber machine gun. "They're going to be coming from that direction," Mac explained, pointing. "When they do, I want you to focus your fire along that portion of the forest, not the front rows of the enemy soldiers. Okay?" The gunner crinkled his eyebrows at the odd request, but responded, "Sure thing, Gunny." Then he clarified, "You want me to focus further behind the enemy soldiers?" Mac nodded. Exactly. Look, when we set up our ambush, the first couple of waves of Chinese just ran headlong into our guns. We smoked them. But there were additional waves behind them. So let the guys in the fighting positions handle the first wave or two. I want you guys to send your rounds into the echelons stacked up behind them. That way, you'll bloody them up before they even get to us." The Marines nearby all nodded, grinning mischievously. It was obvious that some of them were looking forward to the opportunity to slaughter some of the incoming enemy soldiers. Mac left the bunker and made a beeline back to the command post bunker to find Captain Ambrose. When he walked in, he spotted the captain on the radio, talking to someone. Corporal Pyro was using his drone and had it synced with one of the larger monitors on the command post. Looking at the images, Mac saw that the enemy had recovered from the ambush and had already closed the gap on them. They were probably less than a kilometer from them now and steadily moving toward them, like a human tsunami that wouldn't be denied its ability to wash over them. Ambrose snapped his fingers to break Mac's fixation on the impending threat. "We've got several attack helicopters on the way," the captain said. "Battalion is sending the QRF, and so is brigade. Reinforcements are about 60 minutes out. Gunship support is about 20. "Copy that, sir. We'll hold them here," Mac replied. Then he headed out to the line to make sure everyone was as prepared as they could be. Gunny Mac hopped down into one of the fighting positions with a couple of Marines. "You guys ready?" he asked. "You have plenty of ammo?" "Yes, Gunny. We're good to go." Before Mac could say anything else, he heard a higher-pitched whizzing noise and immediately looked up. He spotted a quadcopter drone. It was just like the one their platoon regularly used, only this drone was painted in a slightly different color pattern. Once the drone had spotted them, it quickly shot up several thousand feet before any of the Marines could take a shot at it. Then he heard several more of the little whizzing drones flying toward them. This time the Marines were ready for them. However, these drones didn't fly in like they were looking for them. They flew in like high-speed racing drones. The first one flew right at the Marines, slamming right into the dirt between two fighting positions and summarily exploding. The blast threw dirt, rocks, and tree parts in every direction. Several of the Marines that had been attacked by the drone called out for a medic, while others just moaned and cried in agony from their injuries. Mac didn't even have time to curse or formulate what to do next when a second one of these high-speed little kamikazes slammed right into the fortified bunker on their left flank. The bunker blew apart, showering chunks of its material in all directions. Several corpses and body parts flew into the air, along with the debris from the bunkers. "Holy crap! Did you see that, Gunny?" asked one of the Marines near him, utterly terrified. "How the hell are we supposed to fight that kind of thing?" "Shoot the drones if you see them," Gunny Mac screamed, hoping everyone would hear. Then the same loud shrieking whistle he'd been hearing all day screeched, and the Chinese soldiers came running right at them. "Open fire!" screamed one of the other gunnery sergeants, down in the first row of fighting positions. Rat-a-tat, pop, pop, pop. The roar of gunfire began in earnest as both sides waged a desperate struggle of life and death. The drone above provided an incredible observer's perspective of what was almost a continuous wall of lead mixed with red and green tracers zipping in both directions as thousands of enemy soldiers assaulted the nearly 1 kilometer-long position the Marines were manning. More explosions rippled across the Marine positions as RPG rockets impacted against some of their positions or against the nearby redwoods. The Marines lobbed their own rockets and grenade gun rounds into the enemy positions, adding their own carnage. When the PLA soldiers reached a certain distance from their lines, some of the Marines detonated a series of IEDs they'd jerry-rigged in the areas between the trees and heavy underbrush they'd cleared out. Their hope had been to get the PLA to funnel large numbers of their troops through the more easily passable sections of the forest and then blow them up. As the explosions rippled inside the enemy line, bodies were blown into the air. Screams of pain, agony and sheer terror adding to the chaos. The machine gun bunker that hadn't been blown up opened fire with its heavy 50 caliber slugs, ripping huge holes in the enemy lines. The gunners did exactly what Mac had told them to do, focusing on hammering the second echelon of troops. Mac smiled when he realized what a great job they were doing at ravaging the enemy lines. Then he saw one of those little kamikaze drones zipping right for the bunker. He brought his M27 to his shoulder and fired several rounds at it. He had to lead the little drone a bit because it was really moving. One of Mac's bullets got lucky and nailed the drone when it was less than 20 meters from the bunker. The drone blew up in spectacular fashion, but it also sprayed some of the Marines below it with shrapnel, injuring a few of them. Mac dropped his now empty magazine and slapped a fresh one in place. He slapped the bolt release and quickly had his rifle back against his shoulder, his cheek flush against the side of the stock. He took aim at several PLA soldiers who were doing everything they could to cut a hole in the concertina wire at the base of their outpost. If the PLA could get through this obstacle, it'd be a straight run up the ridge and into their positions. "Trigger the claymores!" one of their lieutenants shouted. Boom, boom, boom! One by one, the claymores detonated, obliterating the attacking enemy soldiers. The shotgun blasts of steel ball bearings cut the enemy soldiers like a scythe. 3 rows of attackers fell to the ground, carpeting the forest floor with more bodies and blood. Then, instead of a whistle signaling more enemy soldiers to charge forward, a green flare shot up through the forest and exploded above the canopy. Mac wasn't sure exactly what that meant, but he knew it probably wasn't good. A wave of those nasty little kamikaze drones zipped through the forest, headed right for their positions. A couple of them were destroyed by some of the Marines as they shot at them, but several more got through, blowing a couple more of the Marines' positions up and killing and injuring many of them. Next, Mac heard a loud roar as hundreds, maybe even thousands of voices echoed through the redwood forest. The next batch of enemy soldiers to emerge were no longer members of the penal battalions or the poorly equipped militia soldiers. These were the regular PLA grunts, outfitted with modern body armor and the best assault rifles China had. The Chinese soldiers charged headlong into the Marine positions, seemingly aware that the Americans had already expended their most deadly defensive weapon available, their Claymore anti-personnel mines. Without the mines or their other IEDs they'd blown up earlier, the regular Army soldiers had a real fighting chance. It was all down to speed and tenacity now. "Hold the line! Hold the line, Marines!" Mac yelled out several times. He got out of his fighting position and did his best to move up and down the line his platoon was hunkered down on. Every now and then, Mac would stop and take aim at a cluster of enemy soldiers. He'd aim for 1 or 2 of them and squeeze off a few rounds. He'd see some of them drop like a switch had been turned off before he'd either move on to another target or stop to help a wounded Marine get back into the fight. One Marine had lost his left hand and tried desperately to get a tourniquet tied on it. Mac stopped shooting long enough to get the medical device situated on his wrist above the wound and tie it off tight enough to stop the bleeding. Then he changed the magazine out for the wounded man and gave his rifle back to him. He pulled a couple more magazines and 2 grenades out for him and put them in front of his fighting hole. He looked at the Marine, who was fighting between going into shock and wanting to kill the enemy. Mac placed his face right in the young man's face. "I need you to keep fighting, Marine," he directed. "Everyone is counting on you right now. Keep killing them, and we'll get you some help as soon as we can. Will you do that for your brothers?" The Marine suddenly had a look of hate and determination burning in his eyes. "You can count on me, Gunny," he exclaimed. Then he turned to face the attackers. Using his one good hand to hold the pistol grip, the young man used his arm with the missing hand to balance the front half of his rifle. Then he started shooting at the enemy soldiers, who were now no more than 40 or 50 meters from him. Max saw that the first row of fighting positions was about to get overrun. He aimed his rifle at several PLA soldiers who were charging forward and fired off several controlled bursts with his infantry assault rifle, hitting 2 of them. He then moved slightly and squeezed off another few rounds, hitting 2 more enemy soldiers. Dropping his now empty magazine, Mac grabbed for a fresh one and slapped it in place. Just as he was about to bring his rifle to bear, something hit him in the center of his chest plate. He was stunned by the sudden punch to his chest, and another object slammed into his helmet, which threw him backwards off his feet. When Gunny Mac fell to the ground, he wasn't sure what the hell had just happened. All he knew was his head was swimming, and he was having an incredibly hard time trying to focus on what was going on around him. Despite what he knew must have been an intense amount of gunfire and shooting going on, it all sounded distant, almost like he was underwater, listening to it from a faraway place. Then he saw something truly unique. It almost looked like a red finger of God had reached down from the sky above them. His vision faded, and he could barely see what was happening. But 2 more red fingers appeared from the clouds above. Before he could process what was going on, Mac's world started to turn dark. His blurred vision became more and more tunneled. Then he slipped into the darkness.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.